there were 3 Japanese standing just outside our barbed wire perimeter. One on the left fell to the ground when the sentry fired. The one in the middle turned and disappeared into the jungle. And the third one held a grenade up to his head and blew his head off in front of everybody.
They were clearing up the prisoner of war camps. It was terrible.
Welcome to the podcast where we track down Australian war veterans, have a chat with them, and hear their stories. I'm Alex Lloyd, and this is Life on the Line.
The single greatest sacrifice I've made is my family.
We weren't out there to take country, we were out there to do something. That was our job.
I did feel a lot of regret.
Friends were still getting killed.
It got to the point where, you're going to funerals quite often.
Do I lead under fire?
And that was a heavy responsibility, I guess, on my shoulders that I didn't want to screw up.
War itself is horrific. It's a horror story. It should never be dressed up as if it's something glorious.
Not what you can do for yourself, but what can you do for your country.
The volunteer for service was in effect to put your life on the line.
Frederick and Marjorie Logan are both veterans of World War II. Fred served in an artillery regiment and fought against the Japanese in the Battle of Slater's Knoll in Bougainville, 1945. After the war, he served in the New South Wales Police Force for over 3 decades. His wife, Marjorie, served in the Australian Women's Army Service, driving ambulances for soldiers and Australian prisoners of war returning from overseas. Today, Fred is 100 years old and Marjorie is 98. I spoke with them both on the date of their 75th wedding anniversary in their nursing home in Queensland. I'm Alex Lloyd, speaking today with World War II veteran Frederick Logan at Tricare Cypress Gardens on the Gold Coast in Queensland. Fred, where were you born?
In Narrabri, New South Wales, on the 30th of January 1925.
Fred, can you tell me a bit about your upbringing, what your childhood was like?
I lived in several small towns when I was growing up because my father was in the police and he was stationed at one-man stations in New South Wales. We started in Narrabri, then we went to Somerton, a small town near Tamworth, then out to a little town called Angledool near Lightning Ridge, then to Marulan near Goulburn, and finally to a bigger town called Warhope near Port Macquarie. I left home when I was 16 and went to live with my grandparents in Sydney. I got a job as a clerk with a firm that made envelopes and writing pads until I turned 18, then I joined the army.
Do you remember when Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced that war had been declared by Australia on Germany?
Yes, I do, yes.
What was your reaction at the time?
Well, I was only young and it didn't affect me much. I didn't worry too much about it.
You would have been about 14?
Yes.
I suppose at that age you think it's probably going to be over before you could possibly join.
Yes.
Say when you're 17 and the war is going on and Japan is now involved, are you then looking at differently and are you interested in serving or you will serve?
I couldn't wait till I was 18 to join up, yeah. I had to decide whether I wanted to join the Air Force, the Navy or the Army. And I chose the Army. I knew more about the Army and I had an uncle that was already in the Army. He was telling me it was good fun, so good idea to go with him.
So on the 11th of February, 1943, you attend the Sydney Showground, a recruiting depot. You spend 10 days there getting a uniform, your rifle, cholera and tetanus injections, and you start learning some basic drills.
Yes.
At the end of that period, you're posted to an artillery regiment.
Just out of Albury. The whole regiment moved back to Greater, near Singleton, and I did a signals course there. Became an artillery signaller.
Can you explain to the listener the role of an artillery signaller?
It was to go forward to the forward infantry and go out on patrol with them. When they came on a suitable target, I would relay information back to the gunners and they would fire the shells over. We would hear the shells whistle over our head and explode in the jungle just in front of us. My main job was to send the information back to the gunners from the front.
During training, you're injured. You spend some time at Concord Hospital where later in the war, your wife will be ferrying lots of soldiers too, but you don't know each other at that time.
No.
Then you're back to active duty. And not long after you return to active duty, you undertake jungle warfare training in Canungra here in Queensland. What's your memory of that?
I remember every morning we had to run about 3 miles for a wash in a river or in a small stream, instep. It was downhill, march back up the hill for breakfast. I did my course there and then they pulled me out to become an instructor and I stayed on for a couple of months instructing other soldiers.
As part of the jungle warfare, you are first learning and then you're teaching yourself working with submachine guns, bayonets, unarmed combat, survival techniques in rainforests, and you stayed there as an instructor for a while. Were you happy with that role, or were you wanting to go overseas and fight?
I didn't have much say. I was promoted to corporal, and I just had to do what I was told.
Were there any other instructors there that had prior experience overseas, or were they sort of in the same boat as you?
They were in the same boat as me, yeah.
You're talking about all the running to and from for breakfast, things like that. It was quite hard training.
Yes.
And quite a hot, sweaty part of the world.
Yeah.
When you're going through all that, do you think back to that uncle's advice that told you the army was good fun and thank him for his misinformation?
He was stationed at Middle Head in Sydney Harbour. How good to be there, but I never got there with him. He eventually went overseas, but...
he won the lottery in domestic
yes, he did, yes.
posting, I think. Do you know where he went overseas?
No, I don't.
So you trained troops at Kanunga for about 6 months to fight in the jungle, and then finally it's your turn. You do get to go to New Guinea. Your turn comes December 1944. Before you get on the ship and get going, you are unceremoniously demoted to the rank of gunner. Can you explain that?
Yes, I thought I was going to be corporal for good, but it was only whilst I was instructing at Kanunga. It wasn't necessary after that.
So you board the SS Shawnee on the 5th of January 1945, and you have 4 days at sea. When you're on the ship, you don't know where you're headed.
No, I had no idea.
And then you land on an island. I assume you don't know where you are still, or do you get told the day you're landing?
Sometime after we were told, yes, but I still didn't know where Bougainville was.
So you land in Bougainville. Where do you land in Bougainville?
At a place called Torquay, which was the main base there. Americans had landed there about 12 months before and hunted the Japanese out of the area, and they built an airstrip and they left supplies and fuel there, and they moved on.
So my understanding is that the task of the Australian troops, including yourself at that time, was to clear the Japanese off the island.
Yes.
And the intelligence you had at the time estimated the Japanese force at about 18,000, but in reality there were around 40,000.
Yes.
And also the general opinion was that they would be running low on food and ammunition. In reality, they were well supplied.
Well, they used native gardens to grow vegetables, and they had no contact with anybody. They had no ships, no aeroplanes, and they had no communication with Japan. Didn't know how the war was progressing. Well, they were there for probably close to 2 years, so they must have had a fair bit of food.
It's impressive, though, that they were so resourceful as to find means to grow new food to supplement their ongoing needs, because I think it was a fair assumption on our part that they would be low on supplies, but they seem to have made their own way work quite well.
Yeah.
So you're walking to a situation where you think the enemy force is less than half what it actually is, and you think their conditions are worse than they actually are.
Yes.
And you're assigned to 5 Battery, 2nd Australian Field Regiment.
Yes.
You join them 13 January, so 5 days after you land. So those first few days, before you get into any action, you're just in Torquay, getting used to the environment. And do you remember how it felt landing there and feeling that you are now close to the front line, you are now serving in an active theatre of war?
Well, I didn't have any fear or anything. I never saw any Japanese, so it was hard to understand what was going on, really. When I went by barge down the coast to join the regiment, they were already in action, but they were merely firing the guns periodically to harass the Japanese. And in fact, they harassed them that much. The Japanese sent 3 men back to blow up the guns. We were having lunch one day, and the sentry on duty fired his machine gun. When we looked over to see what he was firing at, there were 3 Japanese standing just outside our barbed wire perimeter. The one on the left fell to the ground when the sentry fired. The one in the middle turned and disappeared into the jungle. And the third one held a grenade up to his head and blew his head off in front of everybody. That was a bit of a shock.
Was that your first exposure?
Yes.
And so rather than be taken prisoner, that was the path he chose?
Yes.
At the guns there, were they constantly being harassed by the Japanese forces?
The guns weren't being harassed, no. It was only when we went forward to the forward infantry that we got harassed a few times. The infantry, not the guns.
Leaving aside the enemy for the moment, let's talk about the conditions you were facing. The weather, jungle, diseases. Was disease a rife problem for your unit?
No, we'd had injections for malaria, and we were taking tablets every day. No, it was terribly hot, soaked with perspiration nearly all the time. But other than that, it wasn't too bad. Food was dropped to us by plane. Most of our supplies were dropped.
Did you know other men there, or were you new to the battery?
I didn't know them before, no. I had to mix with the 3 or 4 other signallers. I had nothing to do with the guns. 4 or 5 men had to handle each gun, but I had nothing to do with them. I was a signaller only.
So you actually would have had more interaction with the enemy via your proximity to the infantry than if you were a gunner operating the actual artillery itself.
Yes.
Did you often find yourself then sort of witnessing or a part of little skirmishes or interactions when you were with the infantry?
We were attacked once or twice, but usually the Japanese didn't hang around long because they knew we would bring in artillery fire, so they didn't stay long. But we were travelling along a narrow track one day with an infantry scout just ahead, and there was a burst of machine gun fire up ahead. Forward scout dropped dead on the path. We couldn't get to him, so we had to back off and we retreated about 100 yards and brought in some artillery fire. Because it was getting dark, we stayed there the night. Next morning, we went forward and the scout was still lying where he'd fallen. He was dead, of course, and we had to attach a rope to his leg and pull him back because the Japs had a habit of hiding a grenade underneath dead bodies, and when you move the body, the grenade would explode. But luckily, there was no grenade this time, and we were able to get him back out of the way. The Japs had gone, of course.
Do you ever get used to that pattern of life?
Yes, he got used to it fairly quick, yeah.
And your mindset is just get on with it?
Yeah.
Were the other signallers you were with, was this also their first exposure to war, or had they been serving prior?
The regiment had been in New Guinea before it came to Bougainville, and I think they had some exposure to the Japanese there. One of them had been killed, and I was really a replacement for him when I went to Bougainville.
As the weeks went on, did you get an impression of what the condition of the enemy was like in terms of their strength of forces or their supplies, things like that, or you were just dealing with it encounter by encounter?
Towards the end, forward scouts kept coming up against more and more Japanese, and they realised they were gathering to make an attack on us. So we retreated to an area known as Slater's Knoll. It was a small area of ground backed onto a river. We cleared away a bit of the jungle and put up some barbed wire around the perimeter and dug foxholes and waited. About 6 o'clock that night, our phone line went dead, so we knew they'd cut the cable. But they didn't attack until just on daylight the following morning.
On the 28th of March?
Yeah. First thing that happened, about half a dozen mortar bombs came over and one landed close to my mate and I and blew all the dirt that we dug out of the foxhole, blew all that in on top of us, buried us in the hole, and then they attacked in waves, the officers in front waving swords and men behind, mainly only with rifles, shouting and yelling all the time. There was a bedlam for the next half hour or so with the noise from machine guns and rifles and hand grenades. Eventually what were left of them backed off. My mate and I were told to return to our regiment. Before I left, I noticed there were a lot of dead bodies lying on the ground right up to the front foxholes, and there were some bodies hanging on the barbed wire around the perimeter. I was back there about a week later and I saw a sign that read 250 Japanese buried here. I don't know whether that was true or not, but there was certainly a lot killed.
Did any of the Japanese actually breach the perimeter on that first morning?
No, Australians didn't suffer any casualties. No, I think they were heavily armed, 3 or 4 machine guns, and I think the Japanese were down to rifles by that stage.
So you have good, strong defensive positions. You've got the barbed wire. Being in a defensive position gives a natural advantage. You've obviously also got the artillery that you're communicating with, and their best options, the Japanese, is massed attacks and charging, and that sort of traditional well-known image of officers with swords leading the charge while the men behind fire rifles. Are you firing a weapon at all, or you're just communicating?
I did have an Owen submachine on which I fired a couple of magazines, but you couldn't tell whether you hit anything. It was semi-darkness and the air was full of blue smoke. The job to tell whether you hit anything or not.
Were you relaying information to the guns as well for this particular engagement?
No, not during that attack because they were too close. The Japs were too close and the shellers would have had to land almost on top of us.
You're involved in that first day of what's officially that period of the Battle of Slater's Knoll. That whole battle is regarded to last about a week or so, or just over that. On the night of 4-5 April, the Japanese heavily shelled the Australian artillery battery. Were you there when that occurred?
Yes, I must have been, yes.
Do you have a recollection of being shelled by them at that time? Or
I only remember one big gun that they had used to fire shells over periodically. None were landed near us. We'd hear them explode in the jungle all around us, but none actually where we were with the guns.
Was that morning at Slater's Knoll, would you say that's sort of the heaviest contact you were involved in?
Yes.
Did it quieten down relatively after that for you?
Yes.
Because the Japanese were repelled successfully?
Yes. Well, as I say, I went back to the regiment. I didn't see any more of the infantry for a while. And it wasn't long after that we heard about the first atomic bomb exploding, and then the second one shortly after. And then not long after that, we heard that peace had been declared.
So you're in Bougainville until the end of the war, and you, of course, the Australians all have access to information about the outside world, about the atomic bombs. What was the reaction like among your regiment when you heard about these bombs being dropped, these larger-than-life brand new weapons?
Oh, well, of course, everyone was happy. We moved out of the jungle back to Torquay.
You made the point before that the Japanese on Bougainville were cut off and they had no idea how the war was progressing. Did that mean that some were still there, still fighting after surrender?
They were. We captured a couple and sent them back to tell the others the war was over, but they wouldn't believe us. And eventually they sent a plane over to drop some pamphlets on them. And they were finally convinced, and they were told to congregate on a beach, which they did, and barges were sent down to pick them up. They were taken to Torquay.
Were they cooperative?
Yes.
Do you feel some just still refused to believe it?
I suppose some did, reluctantly, but when they saw everyone else was surrendering, they must have known that it was over.
And so you were still there for when that transfer occurred?
Yes.
Did you see them on the beach?
Yes.
That must have been quite a sight, seeing, you've been finding them in the jungle for months and then you finally just see them all gathered there like that.
Yeah.
How many roughly were there? Thousands?
Thousands, yes. We'd only seen them when we were in action, only seen them in small groups. When they all came out of the jungle onto the beach, we were surprised at how many there were, yeah.
That's quite an image. The men you served with there, did you remain mates with any of them after the war?
Only one. I kept in touch with him for a while, but I've lost contact now. The others all came from Victoria, so I lost contact with them after the war ended. Some men were being sent home because they were married or had jobs to go to, but I was well down the list to be sent home because I was young and single. Whilst I was there, I was transferred over to Rebel on a warship. My 21st birthday. Yeah, seasick all the way. It wasn't a very pleasant trip.
You find yourself injured in Bougainville, though, so much so that you spend a month in hospital in Rabaul and then you're transported home to Concord in a body cast for 3 months, I believe. Can you tell me more about the injury?
I developed a swelling on my lower back and I was put into hospital, and they decided it was some type of arthritis because I'd been wet all the time, sleeping in foxholes half full of water. And when it rained every day, you couldn't get under cover and you were wet with perspiration all the time. And anyhow, they decided to immobilise my back so the swelling would go down. They put me in a plaster cast from my neck to my ankles, flew me home, and I spent 3 months in that plaster cast in Concord Hospital.
Were you also carrying heavy radio equipment at times as well?
Yes.
Do you think that contributed to the injury?
It could have helped, yes. We used a phone as much as possible by trailing a cable out behind us when we walked, but if we went too far for the length of the cable, we had to resort to wireless here.
And so you go to Rabaul, you have that lovely seasick 21st birthday, you then have that time convalescing in hospital over there and then back home. It's funny, we'll never know. It could have been your future wife, Marjorie, could have been the ambulance driver transporting you.
It could have been.
Small, funny world. So you recover sufficiently, obviously, in Concord. Does that injury ever resurface for you?
I've had trouble over the years with my back. I wore a surgical corset for a while, and I've seen physiotherapists and taken plenty of tablets, but at the moment, it's fairly good. It's only been periodically that I've had trouble, but at the moment, fairly good.
And when did you meet your wife, Marjorie?
After I got out of the army, I went to Maitland to live for a while. My parents were there. I had a job in a rayon mill for about 15 months. And then I went to Sydney and joined the New South Wales Mounted Police. And it was while I was there that I looked for somewhere to live close to the stables, and I found a boarding house. And when I went there, Marge and her mother were staying there. They came from Crookwell. Her mother was in Sydney for some medical treatment, and we got to know each other at the boarding house.
Before we continue with Fred's story, let's hear from Marjorie Logan, nee Leanie. I spoke with her about growing up during the Great Depression and her service as an ambulance driver in the war. There's a little background noise now and then, activity in the nursing home. This is her story. Tell me about your childhood. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
My parents came out from England. Dad had been in the English Army during the First World War. Before that, he'd gone to Canada and joined the Canadian Army. And then he came back to England and met Mum, and they got married. Things weren't real good in England, so he applied for this job with this oil company, which is like today, and you get the car and the house. So Mum and Dad came out with Dorothy, my elder sister, and they had a big adventure ahead of them of sailing out to Australia. Everything was paid for.
So you were born in Woollahra in Sydney. So you were born in 1927.
Yes.
So your dad had come out to Australia from England on a promising job with the oil company. The Great Depression hits. You're very young. Does the Depression cause you to leave Woollahra and go up north?
Yes. The oil industry collapsed.
So he was going out looking for work in the country wherever he could.
His mate took him to the markets and bought this horse because they wanted to go west.
So they wanted to go sort of rural New South Wales and
Yes.
find work on the land.
Yes.
Because I suppose even in the hardest times, the land always needs to be worked. People need to eat. How did that go? So did you all pick up as a family and move inland?
In a horse and cart, yes.
Literally in a horse and cart.
In a horse and cart with no cover on it. And then we got out to a place, Toowoomba, the gold mining place there. So Dad set up camp, and then he built a little cottage for Mum and us on the side of the creek where he used to go panning, you know.
So your dad was panning for gold,
Yes.
trying to find any scraps he could to help with the family. After the worst of the Depression passes, what happens to your family? Did they find work?
We shifted from that place to another place in Crookwell, and Dad started up his business building. He was a clever man, my dad.
1945, you join up the Australian Women's Army Service and become an ambulance driver at home. Do you remember how that sort of came about?
I did my schooling in Crookwell. And then when I left, I got a job in a baker's shop. When the war started, all I wanted to do was get into the army, like Dad had and my brothers and that were. So I joined up when I was 18.
So your family's moved to the country as a result of the Great Depression. You see out your upbringing, your schooling days there, join the bakery, and then as soon as you turn 18, which is 1945, you sign up for active service, which is something you felt a patriotic duty to do throughout the course of the war, and you get to join at the tail end of it. There's not many options for women to serve at this time.
I was lucky to get an ambulance driver. Most of them were cooks or...
We often had soldiers that were grievously injured overseas being sent back home.
Oh, yes, we were bringing them back.
So you're shepherding around soldiers that have been overseas, they're back home, and you're bringing them to hospital, transit, things like that?
Hospital planes and ships.
Hospital planes and ships with the troops.
The troops that were injured had come off, we'd pick them up, then we'd take them to the hospital. And the main hospital was
Concord Hospital in Sydney.
And we used to take them there because we were stationed at Liverpool.
You would have supplemented the civilian ambulance force when
Yes.
necessary. Some of them would have had very bad injuries.
Oh, yes, yeah.
Was that upsetting?
Yes, but I don't know, you seem to get used to it.
It becomes normal and you get on with it.
Yeah, it was just transporting on stretchers from the plane or the boats onto our ambulance. And we were the ones that had to get them onto the ambulance and fit them all in and then drive all the way to the hospital. Sometimes we'd have a guard with us, but often we did all this. Then we were on night duty at Liverpool, where our base was. In the middle of the night, you'd get called up to go to some hospital way out, or son had come home and leave and got malaria. We'd have to go out and find the farm. We didn't have an orderly with us. We just had to rely on our little bit of general knowledge.
Because a lot of soldiers coming back, they're not just going to necessarily have combat injuries, they will have illness, particularly in the Pacific Theatre. There's a lot of jungle diseases, things like that. Your duty of care extended to picking up patients that were having follow-up illnesses as a result of their service and bringing them back for treatment. That would have kept you very busy. You were a driver from May 1945 to June 1947. Was the busiest period for you that first year while the war was still going on in the Pacific?
Or no, I'd say when they were clearing up the prisoner of war camps and bringing home the prisoners of war, that was terribly upsetting because I went down to meet a boat, one of the first boats back from one of the big camps, prisoner of war camps over there. It was terrible.
So you helped transport Australians that had been in Japanese prisoner of war camps, and you were bringing them for medical attention.
Oh, I mean, only from the boat or the plane.
The boat to the hospital, but
yeah.
But still, those brief interactions with them, I just from seeing images in documentaries and things like that, incredibly malnourished, incredibly mistreated in a bad way, I'm sure.
A lot of them blind.
And you felt you were contributing to the war effort as well.
In a way, yeah. Wasn't going to go on forever because they were bringing the good fellows back too that we'd taken their jobs. So they'd start to come back and take our jobs, drivers. And the young fellow that took my ambulance the first day, I was still there. My ambulance had been signed over to him and I was being discharged. He bombed it out on the road. Oh, I was happy because I loved it. You know, we used to treat them like a baby, our ambulances.
How did you find adjusting from that ambulance role to back to civilian life?
It was hard.
And although you and Fred did not know each other during the war, you both serve in your own ways.
Yes.
And then after the war, Fred goes on to be with New South Wales Police for well over 30 years.
Yes.
What was it like being a policeman's wife?
It was interesting. I learned how to cook. I had to cook meals for them because we were way out in the bush sometimes.
You'd put off the cooking during the war, but now you had to do it at the home. Fred has his career in New South Wales with the police force there. You now both live in Queensland and it's been a very happy life.
Yes.
Marge, thank you so much for speaking with me today and sharing your memories.
Thank you for having me.
And now, back to Fred. How did you find that transition into civilian life? You do swap the green for the blue, so to speak, and you swap one form of service for another, but did that help?
The army became just a distant memory. I was in the police for 35 years, so it became everything and the army was forgotten.
Did the work in the police give you that focus to just move on and make it a memory and leave it in the past?
Yes, I didn't think too much about it. It didn't affect me that much. Apart from coming home in the plaster cast, that's about all the problems I had.
What year do you meet Marjorie?
It must have been 1948.
And then you wed in 1950?
Yes. I was transferred to Muswellbrook. I went back to Sydney and we were married there, and then she came to Muswellbrook with me.
And does your career in the police take you all over New South Wales?
Yes, quite a few towns. I ended up as an inspector on the southern part of Wollongong, 7 stations under my control from Port Kembla down to Kiama. Then I resigned and Marge and I started doing some overseas travelling.
Well, Fred, it strikes me that you have served a lot your country. You've given a life of service, those 4 years in one uniform and the near 40 years in another uniform. They're occupations, but they contribute to the larger good and well-being of our country, one through defence, one through policing, and it's a really admirable line of work that you've done. So just thank you for all that you've given to Australia over your many years of service. And you are now in this beautiful retirement home in Queensland. You're here with your wife, and we have the sun streaming in on us on a nice hot Gold Coast day in May, and it's just great to be here. And thank you for everything you've given this country.
Thank you.
And congratulations as well, I must say, because I happen to be recording this on the 18th of May 2025, which is your 75th wedding anniversary with Marjorie. That's incredible. You're here at 100 years of age. Marge is 98, and that's just all wonderful. So I'm very happy for you both, and congratulations.
Thank you.
We're so grateful to Fred and Marge for speaking with us, and their son Bob and daughter Kerry, who helped facilitate this interview. For another story on this podcast of fighting the Japanese in New Guinea, jump back to season 6 and listen to 127, Reg Chard.
Don't ask me why, but everybody seemed to know when they're going to die. And it didn't make them how old or how young they were, the person they called out for. I want my mum.
You can also watch that video podcast on our YouTube channel. We have captured plenty of other World War II stories, both through our podcast and also our For School and Country video documentary miniseries, and the book we collaborated on with Michael Veitch, BARNEY GREATREX. Find out more at www.lifeonthelinepodcast.com. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Life on the Line Podcast, on X at LOTL Pod, and on LinkedIn at Thistle Productions. You can email us at podcast@lifeonthelinepodcast.com. Life on the Line is brought to you by Thistle Productions. Artwork by Big Cat Design. Music by Dan Van Werkhoven. Thank you for listening, and lest we forget.